Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 true disturbing stories from the remote backroads of Alabama. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten hollows and abandoned stretches of rural highway and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The stretch of County Road 47 that runs between Cullman and Bankhead National Forest has always been one of those roads nobody uses unless they absolutely have to. It cuts through dense pine forest for about 18 miles, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, with no cell service and maybe 3 houses the entire way. I grew up about 5 miles from where it connects to Highway 278, and my dad used to take it as a shortcut when we'd go camping at Sipsey Wilderness when I was a kid. I'm 34 now, and I hadn't driven that road in probably 15 years when I found myself on it last October. My GPS had routed me that way coming back from a wedding in Jasper. I should have known better than to trust it in that part of the state, but I was tired and just wanted to get home to Huntsville. It was around 10:30 at night, which is that late, but on County Road 47, it might as well have been 3 in the morning. The darkness out there is complete. No streetlights, no porch lights, nothing but your headlights and the trees pressing in on both sides. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when my car started making this ticking sound. Not loud, just this rhythmic tick-tick-tick coming from somewhere under the hood. I'm not great with cars. I can change a tire and check the oil, but that's about it. The sound wasn't alarming exactly, but it was new, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, hoping it would just stop on its own. It didn't stop. If anything, it got a little louder. I was debating whether to pull over and pop the hood when I came around a curve and saw something in the road ahead. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was about the right size, standing maybe 50 yards ahead in the middle of my lane. But as I got closer and the headlights hit it full on, I realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was a person. A woman, I thought, wearing what looked like a pale dress or nightgown. She was just standing there completely still, facing my direction. I slowed down, my stomach doing this little flip. You don't expect to see someone standing in the middle of an empty road at night, especially not dressed like that. My first thought was that she'd been in an accident, that maybe her car had gone off the road and she was in shock or hurt. I rolled down my window as I came to a stop about 20 feet from her. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't move at all. She was far enough ahead that I couldn't make out her features clearly, but I could see she had long dark hair that hung down past her shoulders. The dress, or whatever it was, looked thin, almost translucent in my headlights. It occurred to me that it was probably 50 degrees out, too cold to be wearing something like that. I put the car in park and opened my door, keeping 1 foot inside. "Miss, are you hurt?" "Still nothing." And that's when I noticed something that made my throat tighten. She wasn't breathing, or rather I couldn't see her breath in the cold air. Mine was coming out in visible puffs, but from where she stood there was nothing. I told myself I was too far away to see it, that the angle was wrong or something, but I didn't believe it. "I'm going to call for help," I said, even though I knew my phone wouldn't have service. I reached back into the car for it anyway, just to do something with my hands. When I looked back up, she'd moved, not walked, moved. She was at least 10 feet closer than she'd been a second ago, and I hadn't seen her take a single step. She was just suddenly closer, still standing in that same rigid posture, still facing me. I dropped my phone. It hit the road with a plastic clatter, and I lunged back into my car, yanking the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the car back in drive. When I looked through the windshield again, she'd moved even closer. Maybe 15 feet away now, close enough that I could see her face. There wasn't one. Where her features should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin stretched over the vague suggestion of a skull. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank, empty smoothness that caught the light from my headlights in a way that made my stomach lurch. I don't remember deciding to move. My foot just hit the gas and the car lurched forward. She was directly in front of me now, and for one horrible second I thought I was going to hit her, whatever it was. But as the car surged forward, she moved again, that same impossible instantaneous movement, and suddenly she was beside my driver's side window instead of in front of me. I saw her, its head turned to follow me as I passed, that smooth, blank face tracking my movement. Then I was past her, my car accelerating down the road, the ticking sound from the engine completely forgot. I didn't touch the brakes for the next 5 miles. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see that pale figure standing in the middle of the road behind me, but there was only darkness. The ticking sound stopped on its own about 10 minutes later. I never figured out what caused it. Could have been a loose belt, could have been nothing. A piece of gravel in the wheel well, maybe. But sometimes I wonder if it was ever real at all, or if it was just something to get me to slow down on that particular stretch of road. I took Highway 278 home that night, even though it added 30 minutes to the drive. I haven't been back to County Road 47 since. Last month I was talking to my dad about something else entirely, and County Road 47 came up. He got quiet for a second, then asked if I still took that road sometimes. When I told him no, he seemed relieved. He said when I was a kid, we only went camping at Sipsey twice, even though I remembered it being more. He said after the second time, he decided he didn't like that drive at night, that something about it felt wrong. He never told me why, and I didn't ask. Some things you don't need to put into words. I still have the phone I dropped that night. There's a crack across the screen from where it hit the pavement. Sometimes when I look at it, I can almost convince myself the whole thing was my imagination, that I was tired and it was dark and I just saw someone who needed help and panicked for no reason. But then I remember that blank face turning to watch me drive past, and I know better. Whatever I saw on County Road 47 wasn't looking for help. I don't know what it was looking for. I'm just glad I didn't stop long enough to find out. Story 2. My Uncle Randall left me his property when he died 3 years ago. 48 acres in Lawrence County, way up near the Tennessee border, most of it wooded except for a clearing where his trailer sat. I'd been out there maybe twice in my life before I inherited it. Once when I was 10 for a 4th of July barbecue, and once in high school when my mom made me help him split firewood. Both times I'd thought it was beautiful in that isolated, slightly melancholy way rural Alabama can be. Lots of oak and sweet gum trees, a little creek that ran through the eastern part of the property, and enough distance from neighbors that you could pretend you were the only person for miles. Uncle Randall had been a quiet guy, never married, worked as a machinist in Decatur for 40 years before he retired. When he died, heart attack, quick and probably painless. The property came to me because I was his only nephew and his only living relative besides my mom, who didn't want to deal with it. The trailer itself was in rough shape, but the land was paid off, and I figured I could either sell it or maybe fix the place up as a hunting cabin or weekend retreat. I drove down from Nashville on a Friday in late March to start going through his things. My plan was to spend the weekend sorting out what to keep, what to trash, and what to donate, then figure out next steps. It was about a 3-hour drive from where I live, mostly highway and then increasingly narrow roads until I turned onto the gravel driveway that led back to the trailer. The place looked exactly like I remembered, except more rundown. The trailer's siding had faded to a dingy gray beige, and the wooden steps leading up to the door were soft with rot. The clearing around it was overgrown with tall grass and brambles, and the woods seemed to have crept a little closer in the years since I'd last been there. I parked next to Uncle Randall's old Ford pickup, which was still sitting where he'd left it, now covered in a layer of pollen and dead leaves. The front door was unlocked. I don't think Uncle Randall ever locked it, and inside everything was exactly as he'd left it. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter, reading glasses on the armrest of his recliner, a stack of mail on the table. It smelled like stale air and dust, and something vaguely chemical that I couldn't quite place. I opened a few windows to let in fresh air, then started making a pile of trash bags and boxes I'd brought from the car. I worked until the sun started going down, mostly just sorting through papers and clothes, and I decided to spend the night in the trailer rather than drive back to Nashville and return the next day. Uncle Randall's bed was made, and after I convinced myself the sheets were clean enough, I grabbed some leftovers from the cooler I'd brought and settled in for the evening. That's when I noticed the pull-down attic access in the hallway ceiling. I don't know why it caught my attention. I'd walked past it probably 6 times already that day, but something about it stood out suddenly. Maybe it was the light, or maybe I'd just been too focused on other things before. The wooden panel had a small metal ring attached to it, and there was a thin gap around the edges that suggested it had been opened relatively recently. Dust usually seals those things pretty well after a few years. I found a stepladder in the shed outside and pulled the attic access down. A folding ladder descended, old but sturdy, and a wave of warmer, mustier air washed over me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and climbed up. The attic space was low-ceilinged, maybe 4 feet at the highest point, and ran the length of the trailer. The flashlight beam swept across exactly what you'd expect to find: cardboard boxes, old Christmas decorations, a rolled-up sleeping bag. But at the far end, near the back of the trailer, I saw something that made me pause. There was a pile of photographs spread out on the plywood floor, not in a box, not scattered randomly, spread out deliberately in a grid pattern like someone had been looking at them. I crawled over, my knees pressing into the insulation between the floor joists. The photographs were all of the same thing: the woods around the property. Dozens of them, maybe more than 100, all taken from different angles and at different times of day. Some were clearly shot in summer with full green canopy. Others were in fall or winter, the trees bare. I picked one up. It showed a cluster of oaks about 30 yards into the tree line behind the trailer. The photo was slightly out of focus, but I could make out something pale in the background between 2 of the trunks. I picked up another photo. This one showed a different section of woods, but again there was something pale and indistinct visible in the middle distance. I went through more of them. In every single photograph there was that same pale blur or shape, sometimes barely visible, sometimes more obvious. Always in the background, always partially obscured by trees or shadow. My first thought was that Uncle Randall had been trying to photograph deer or wildlife, and these were just failed shots he'd kept for some reason. But the pale shapes didn't look like deer. They didn't look like animals at all. They were too vertical, too still. I gathered up a handful of the photos and climbed back down from the attic. In the trailer's kitchen, under better light, I looked at them more carefully. In one image, taken in winter with snow on the ground, the pale shape was clear enough that I could make out a suggestion of shoulders and a head. It was standing behind a tree, partially hidden, as if it had been watching when the photo was taken. I set the photos down on the counter and walked to the window above the sink. It looked out toward the back of the property, toward the same stretch of woods that appeared in the photographs. The sun had set by then, and all I could see was the vague outline of trees against the slightly lighter sky. Something moved out there. I couldn't say exactly what or where, just a shift in the darkness, a sense of motion at the edge of the tree line. My chest tightened and I stepped back from the window instinctively. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring out into the dark, telling myself it was a deer or a trick of the light or my imagination working overtime because of those weird photos. Then I saw it again. Closer this time. Definitely closer. A pale vertical shape, barely distinguishable from the trees around it, moving, no, not moving, appearing in a different position than it had been before, like frames of a film with the middle parts cut out. I backed away from the window and grabbed my car keys from the counter. I didn't pack up my things, didn't close the windows I'd opened, didn't even turn off the lights. I just walked out the front door, down those rotting steps, and got in my car. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced toward the tree line one more time. There were 3 of them now, 3 pale figures standing at even intervals along the edge of the woods, perfectly still, facing the trailer, facing me. I reversed down the driveway faster than I should have, gravel spraying out from under my tires. When I reached the main road and pointed my car back toward the highway, I finally took a full breath. I didn't go back the next day, or the next week. I called a real estate agent in Moulton and told her I had property I wanted to sell as is, sight unseen, no inspections, just find a buyer who wants cheap land. She sounded confused but agreed. The property sold 4 months later to a developer who wanted to parcel it out. I never asked what they ended up doing with it. I still have those photographs. I don't know why I took them with me. I should have left them in the attic where I found them. Sometimes I look through them, trying to find some detail I missed, some explanation that makes sense. But the only thing I ever notice are the shapes in the background, always watching, always waiting. And in one photograph, the most recent-looking one based on the quality of the print, I can see the edge of Uncle Randall's trailer in the foreground. The photo is angled as if it was taken from the woods looking back toward his home. That's the one that bothers me most, because it means at some point Uncle Randall went into those woods and found the camera that took it. Found it and brought it back and developed the pictures. I wonder what he saw out there. I wonder if he saw them up close. And I wonder if that's really why his heart gave out, alone in that trailer with the woods pressing in on every side. Story 3. I moved to Mobile for work about 7 years ago, IT contractor for the shipyards, and I'd been renting a place in Pritchard until I saved up enough for a down payment on something of my own. I'm not picky about houses, but I wanted space and quiet, which in my price range meant looking way outside the city proper. My real estate agent, this cheerful woman named Gretchen who drank Diet Coke like it was water, kept showing me places that were either too expensive or too close to busy roads. Then she mentioned a property in Clark County, about an hour north, that had been sitting on the market for a while. It's a bit isolated, she'd said, which should have been my first clue, but it's got good bones and it's priced to move. The house sat at the end of Dawson Mill Road, which wasn't so much a road as a pair of tire ruts that wound through pine forest for 2.5 miles off Highway 84. The place itself was a small brick ranch, probably built in the 70s, with a detached garage and about 6 acres of land that were mostly wooded. The previous owner had been an elderly woman named Mrs. Carlyle who'd passed away the year before, and her children just wanted it gone so they could split the proceeds. I'll be honest, I probably should have asked why it had been sitting on the market for 8 months at that price. But I was tired of renting, tired of looking, and the house really did have good bones. Solid roof, updated electrical, decent plumbing. So I made an offer, and 3 weeks later it was mine. Moving in took most of a Saturday. I didn't have much furniture, a bed, a couch, some boxes of kitchen stuff and clothes, so by evening I was more or less settled. The sun was setting when I finally sat down on the back porch with a beer, looking out at the wall of pine trees that started maybe 40 feet from the house. It was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that feels too complete, where you become aware of your own heartbeat and breathing. I grew up in Birmingham, so I'm used to traffic noise, sirens, people, all the ambient sound of a city. Out here there was nothing. No cars, no neighbors, not even the sound of insects, yet since it was early April and still a bit cool at night, I was on my second beer when I heard the whistling. It was coming from the woods, faint but clear, a simple melody that repeated after about 8 notes. Someone was out there in the trees, whistling the same little tune over and over. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, trying to see who it was. "Hello," I called out. The whistling stopped. I waited, but there was only silence. After about a minute, I went back inside, figuring it was just someone walking through the woods nearby, maybe heading to a hunting spot or checking a trail. Weird time of day for it. But people did odd things in the country. The next evening, I heard it again. Same time, right around dusk, and the same simple melody. This time I walked out into the yard, right up to the tree line, and called out again. Again, the whistling stopped the moment I spoke. I stood there for a few minutes, feeling increasingly stupid, then went back inside. On the third evening, I was waiting for it. I sat on the porch as the light faded, and sure enough, right at dusk, the whistling started. I didn't call out this time. I just listened, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to be moving, circling around through the trees from west to east, always staying the same distance from the house, maybe 50 or 60 yards back in the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and walked into the trees. The ground was covered with pine needles that muffled my footsteps, and the trunks were spaced far enough apart that it was easy to walk between them. I kept the flashlight off at first, not wanting to announce myself, and moved in the direction where I'd last heard the whistling. It had stopped as soon as I'd stood up, but I figured if I stayed quiet, maybe whoever it was wouldn't realize I was coming. I made it maybe 30 yards before I started feeling like this was a bad idea. The woods were darker than I'd expected, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see the house anymore when I looked back, just trees in every direction. I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but nothing else. No person, no movement, nothing. I swept the light in a slow arc, and that's when I saw the first one. It was a doll. A child's doll, the old-fashioned kind with a porcelain face and cloth body, hanging from a branch by a loop of wire around its neck. It was maybe 10 feet off the ground, turning slowly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Someone's idea of a prank maybe, or some kind of weird art installation. But the doll looked old, its dress faded and stained, its face cracked. I moved the flashlight beam and found another one. This doll was closer to the ground, propped up in the fork of a tree, its arms positioned as if it were reaching upward. Beyond it, I could make out more, hanging from branches, leaning against trunks arranged in small clusters on the ground. Dozens of them spread throughout the woods, all facing in the direction of my house. The whistling started again. It was close now, maybe 20 feet to my left, and it was the same melody, but this time it sounded wrong. Too sharp, too precise, like it was being played on an instrument rather than whistled by a human. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. There was a figure, standing between 2 pine trees. For half a second I thought it was a person wearing a mask, something pale and smooth with no features, but it wasn't a mask. The face was blank, like skin stretched over an unfinished sculpture, and it was tilted at an angle that was slightly too far to be natural, regarding me with that eyeless, mouthless stare. The body was thin, arms hanging at its sides, wearing what might have been old clothes or just rags that clung to its frame. The whistling was coming from it. I don't know how it had no mouth, but the sound was definitely originating from that thing standing in my flashlight beam. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. My legs just moved, carrying me back in what I hoped was the direction of the house. Branches whipped at my face, and the flashlight beam bounced crazily as I crashed through the undergrowth. Behind me, the whistling continued, following at the same measured pace, never getting closer but never fading either. I burst out of the tree line into my backyard and didn't stop until I was on the porch with the door locked behind me. I stood at the kitchen window, breathing hard, watching the woods. The whistling had stopped. Everything was silent again. I called in sick to work the next day and spent the morning packing. By noon, I'd loaded everything I couldn't live without into my car. I didn't call the real estate agent, didn't try to explain, just left the keys on the kitchen counter and drove back to Mobile. I slept on a friend's couch for 2 weeks until I found a new rental, this time in the middle of a busy subdivision where I could hear neighbors and traffic at all hours. The house in Clark County went back on the market after a few months. I'd stopped making mortgage payments, and eventually the bank foreclosed. I lost my down payment and took a hit to my credit, but I didn't care. I never went back, never even drove past Dawson Mill Road again. But sometimes, usually right around dusk, I hear that whistling. Just for a few seconds, faint and distant, the same 8 notes repeating. It never lasts long enough for me to be sure it's real, but I know what it means. It means I'm being reminded. It means something in those woods remembers that I was there and remembers where I went. I've thought about moving again, maybe to a different state entirely. But I don't think it would matter. Some things don't need to follow you physically to make you feel followed. Some things just need you to know they're still out there, whistling in the dark, waiting patiently for the day you might forget to be afraid. Story 4. My sister Diane and I were never particularly close growing up, but after our parents died within 6 months of each other when I was 27 and she was 30, we tried to make more of an effort. She lived in Huntsville with her husband and 2 kids, and I was down in Montgomery working for the state. We'd talk on the phone every couple of weeks and see each other on holidays, which felt like enough for both of us. So when Diane called me on a Tuesday afternoon last November and asked if I wanted to go hiking with her that weekend at Oak Mountain State Park, I was surprised enough that I said yes before I really thought about it. She said she needed to get away from the kids and her husband for a day, needed to clear her head, and would I please just come? She sounded stressed in a way that worried me, so I agreed. We met at the park entrance early Saturday morning. Oak Mountain is huge, about 10,000 acres, and it's one of the largest state parks in Alabama. Lots of trails, campgrounds, a lake, the works. Diane had apparently been researching trails online and wanted to try one of the longer, less trafficked routes that looped around the southern part of the park. She said she'd packed lunches and had printed a map, and that we should plan for about 5 hours round trip. The trailhead was at the end of a gravel parking area that only had 2 other cars in it. The morning was cold, probably in the low 40s, and a light fog hung in the valleys between the hills. We set off around 8:30, Diane leading the way with her printed map and me following along behind with my phone camera, taking occasional pictures of interesting trees or views. For the first 2 hours, it was actually nice. The trail was well marked, the exercise felt good, and Diane gradually started opening up about what was stressing her out. Nothing catastrophic, just the usual accumulation of working full-time and raising kids and feeling like she was always behind on everything. I listened and made the occasional sympathetic noise, and we fell into the kind of easy rhythm that sometimes happens with family when you stop trying so hard. Around 10:30, we stopped for water at a small clearing where the trail split. According to Diane's map, we needed to take the left fork, which would loop us around and eventually bring us back to the parking area. The right fork, according to the map, was a dead-end maintenance trail that didn't go anywhere useful. We took the left fork and kept walking. Maybe 20 minutes later, Diane stopped and pulled out her map again. She frowned at it, then looked around at the trail. "Does this look right to you?" she asked. I looked around. The trail had gotten narrower, more overgrown, and the trail markers, the little painted blazes on the trees, seemed to have disappeared. Maybe we missed a turn. Diane pulled out her phone to check GPS, but she didn't have service. Neither did I. We stood there for a minute, debating whether to keep going or backtrack. Diane was convinced we were still on the right path and that the trail would widen out again soon. I wasn't so sure, but I also didn't want to argue about it, so we kept walking. The trail, if you could still call it that, led us deeper into a section of forest that felt different from where we'd been before. The trees were older, more gnarled, and grew closer together. The undergrowth was thick with mountain laurel and brambles that pressed in from both sides. The fog that had been light earlier seemed thicker here, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. "We should turn back," I said. Diane nodded, but as we turned around, we both realized something. The trail behind us looked completely different from what we just walked through. The trees seemed rearranged, and the path itself, the clear line we'd been following, had vanished. It was just forest in every direction, no obvious way forward or back. "Okay," Diane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Okay, let's pick a direction and walk until we hit something we recognize." We started walking what we thought was back the way we'd come. After about 10 minutes, we found the trail again, or a trail anyway. It looked similar to what we'd been on before, narrow and overgrown. We followed it, and 5 minutes later we emerged into a small clearing. There was a structure in the middle of it. It wasn't a building exactly. More like a shelter or pavilion, 3 walls made of old weathered wood with a corrugated metal roof. The front was open, facing us, and inside I could see a wooden bench and something hanging from the rafters. We approached slowly, neither of us saying anything. The thing hanging from the rafters was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. It had been gutted and skinned, just the muscle and bone remaining, and it was tied up with yellow nylon rope that looked far too new compared to everything else about this place. The smell hit us as we got closer, not the overwhelming stench of rot, but something more subtle and wrong, like meat that had been left out just long enough to start turning. "We should go," Diane said quietly. I nodded, but before we could move, I noticed something else. Scratched into the wooden bench inside the shelter were words. I stepped closer to read them. "Turn back now" was carved deep into the wood, the letters rough and uneven like they'd been done with a knife or rock. Below that, in different handwriting, "It follows." And below that, more recent looking, "Gone since Sept 14. Diane grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Right now." We backed away from the shelter and started walking quickly, not quite running, but close, in what we hoped was the direction back to the main trail. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, and the forest around us felt too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our footsteps on dead leaves. That's when we heard it behind us. Footsteps, not ours. Something was moving through the forest parallel to our path, matching our pace. We couldn't see it through the fog and trees, but we could hear it clearly, the crack of branches, the rustle of undergrowth, the steady rhythm of something walking on 2 legs. We started running. The footsteps behind us sped up. We crashed through the undergrowth, no longer trying to find a trail, just moving away from that sound. Diane was ahead of me, and I could hear her breathing hard, almost sobbing. My lungs burned and branches tore at my jacket and face. We broke through a thick stand of mountain laurel, and suddenly we were on a wide, clear trail. A real trail with fresh wood chips and a proper marker sign. Behind us, the footsteps had stopped. We didn't slow down until we saw the parking area through the trees. When we reached Diane's car, we both just stood there for a minute, hands on our knees, gasping. There were more cars now. It was early afternoon, and the park was busier than when we'd arrived. "What was that?" Diane finally asked. I didn't have an answer. We got in her car and drove out of the park without talking about it. When she dropped me off at my car, she made me promise not to tell her husband. She said he'd think she was crazy, and maybe she was, but she knew what we'd heard. She knew something had been following us. I agreed not to tell anyone. But a few weeks later, I did some searching online. I was trying to find any mention of a wooden shelter in Oak Mountain State Park, something about the southern trails, anything that might explain what we'd found. I didn't find much, but I did come across one forum post from about 2 years ago. Someone had been hiking in the park and got lost in heavy fog. They said they'd found an old shelter that wasn't on any map, and inside was fresh blood on the ground. They reported it to park rangers, who apparently investigated, but said they couldn't find any structure matching that description in that area of the park. The part that made me close my laptop and not search anymore was the last line of the post. The person said that after they left the park, they kept feeling like they were being watched, especially at dusk. Other people in the comments said they'd had similar experiences at Oak Mountain, that there was a part of the park that felt wrong, where people got disoriented and lost even on marked trails. Diane and I don't talk about that hike. We barely talk at all anymore, actually. It's not that we had a fight or anything, it's just that after that day, neither of us seemed to want to make the effort. Maybe it's because talking to each other means remembering what happened and both of us would rather not. But I still have the pictures I took that morning on my phone. I've looked through them maybe 100 times. Most of them are just trees, views, normal hiking stuff. But there's one, taken about 15 minutes before we got lost, that shows Diane walking ahead of me on the trail. She's in focus, her red jacket bright against the gray-green of the forest. But in the background, barely visible through the fog, there's a dark shape standing between two trees about 40 feet back. It's too far away and too blurred to make out details, but it's definitely there, upright and humanoid, and it appears to be watching us walk away. I took that photo at 10:20 in the morning according to the timestamp, which means whatever that thing was, it had been following us for a while before we ever realized we were lost. And I can't help but wonder, if we hadn't found that shelter, if we hadn't started running, would it have just kept following us? And how close would it have eventually gotten before we noticed? Story 5. I drive a delivery truck for a furniture company based in Dothan, and my route covers most of the southeastern part of Alabama. It's a decent job. I work 4 days a week, make okay money, and I'm usually home by dinner. Most of the time, I'm delivering to addresses in town or in subdivisions on the outskirts, but every once in a while I get a rural delivery that takes me way out into the county on roads that barely have names. Last March, I had one of those deliveries, a sectional sofa going to an address on Hargrove Cutoff Road, which I'd never heard of but which GPS promised was real. The customer, a man named Patrick Lowe, had paid for the delivery and setup, so it was just me making the trip, no helper. I loaded the sofa pieces into the truck that morning and headed out around 11 o'clock. Hargrove Cutoff Road turned out to be way south of Geneva, down near the Florida line. The landscape out there is flat and swampy, lots of pine plantations and palmetto thickets, and the occasional ramshackle house set way back from the road. GPS took me onto progressively smaller roads until I finally turned onto Hargrove Cutoff, which was gravel and barely wide enough for my truck. I followed it for about 3 miles before I saw the house. It was a modular home, fairly new-looking, with a gravel driveway and a truck parked out front. I pulled in and climbed out, expecting the customer to come out to meet me, but the place looked deserted. The front door was closed, no lights visible inside despite it being overcast and fairly dim. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again louder and called out, "Furniture delivery for Patrick Lowe." Nothing. I walked around the side of the house to check if maybe he was out back, but all I found was an empty yard that backed up to thick forest. I tried calling the number on the delivery form, but it went straight to voicemail. This wasn't the first time a customer hadn't been home for a delivery they'd scheduled, so I wasn't too concerned yet. I decided to wait for 20 minutes. That's company policy, and if he didn't show, I'd call the office and they'd reschedule. I sat in the truck with the AC running, scrolling through my phone. Every few minutes I'd glance up at the house, hoping to see some sign of activity, but nothing changed. At one point I noticed movement at the edge of the woods behind the house, probably a deer or hog, but when I looked directly at it there was nothing there. The 20 minutes passed. I called the office, explained the situation, and they told me to leave a door tag and bring the furniture back. I grabbed the tag from my glove box, filled it out, and walked back to the front door to stick it on. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully closed anymore. It was open maybe an inch, just enough that I could see darkness beyond it. I was certain it had been shut when I knocked earlier. "Mr. Lowe," I called out, "your furniture's here. I'm going to have to reschedule if..." Something moved inside the house. I couldn't see what, just a shift in the darkness on the other side of the door. Then I heard it, a low, sustained hiss like air escaping from a tire, but longer and wetter. Every instinct I had said to back away from that door. Instead, and I still don't know why I did this, I pushed it open. The interior of the house was dark, all the curtains drawn. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a living room directly ahead, empty of furniture. To the right was a hallway leading to what I assumed were bedrooms. The air smelled strange, like mildew and something coppery. "Hello," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. The hissing came again from the hallway, and then I saw it. There was a shape on the ceiling of the hallway. Not hanging from it, not attached to it, on it, pressed against the surface like gravity didn't apply to it. It was human-sized but wrong, the limbs too long and bent at joints that didn't match up with how arms and legs should work. As I stared at it, it started moving, crawling along the ceiling toward the living room, toward me. The movement was spider-like, smooth and rapid, and the hissing sound was coming from it. I stepped back and slammed the door shut. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, paralyzed, before my brain finally sent the message to my legs: "Run." I sprinted back to the truck, jumped in, and started the engine. As I threw it into reverse, I glanced at the house one more time. The front door was open again, wide open, and the thing was standing in the doorway. Not on the ceiling anymore, but standing upright in a position that was almost human except for the way its arms hung, too long, knuckles nearly brushing the floor. I didn't look back again until I was off Hargrove Cutoff Road and back on pavement. When I got back to the warehouse, I told my supervisor that the customer hadn't been home and I'd left a door tag. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I figured if I told the truth, I'd sound insane, and if I sounded insane, I might not have a job anymore. The next day, the office tried calling Patrick Lowe to reschedule. The number was disconnected. They tried the address again with a different driver 2 weeks later. Carlos, a guy who'd been with the company for 10 years, took the same sofa out to the same address. He came back and said the house wasn't there anymore. He drove up and down Hargrove Cutoff Road twice, checked the GPS coordinates, but there was no house, no driveway, nothing but woods. We figured maybe he'd gotten the wrong road, that there was some GPS error. But I'd taken a photo of the house when I first pulled up. I always do that for rural deliveries in case there's a dispute about the address later. When I showed Carlos the photo on my phone, he went quiet. "That's the road I was on," he said. "I remember that stand of palmetto on the left, but there was no house, just trees. I still have that photo. In the foreground is my truck and the modular home, but if you zoom in on the windows, you can see something. In the window to the left of the front door, there's a pale shape pressed against the glass, 2 dark spots that might be eyes and something that could be a mouth wide open. I didn't notice it when I took the photo. I only saw it later after Carlos came back and said the house was gone. The furniture is still at the warehouse. Nobody else claimed it." The order was paid for with a credit card that apparently doesn't exist. The bank says there's no account associated with that number. And Hargrove Cutoff Road shows up on maps, but I've talked to 3 people now who have tried to find it and can't. It's like it only exists when it wants to be found. I don't take deliveries south of Geneva anymore. I told my supervisor I have family issues that keep me closer to Dothan on delivery days, and he's been good about accommodating me. Sometimes when I'm driving, though, I'll see a road I don't recognize, some little gravel cutoff that looks like it might go somewhere, and I'll feel this pull to turn down it. Like something inviting me to explore to see what's at the end. I never do. I keep driving straight, windows up, radio loud. Because I know what's at the end of those roads. I've seen it. And the fact that it went to the trouble of creating an entire house just to get me to walk through that door means it's patient. It's willing to wait. And sooner or later, if I'm not careful, I might forget to be cautious. I might take a wrong turn. And when I do, I don't think there will be a door for me to slam shut and run from. Story 6. I'd been dating Rebecca for about 8 months when she invited me to her family's cabin for a long weekend. We were both teachers in Tuscaloosa. I taught history at the high school, she taught English at the middle school, and we'd started seeing each other after meeting at some district training event. Things were going well, comfortable, and meeting the extended family at their annual summer gathering felt like a natural next step. The cabin was in Fayette County, she told me, about an hour and a half northwest of Tuscaloosa, on property her grandfather had bought in the 1960s. The whole family gathered there every July 4th weekend, aunts, uncles, cousins, the works, and she wanted me to come along. I said yes, of course. I'd met her parents once and they'd seemed nice enough, and I figured I could handle a weekend of small talk and potato salad. We drove up on Friday afternoon. Rebecca's car loaded with coolers and camping chairs. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on increasingly rough roads, the final stretch being a dirt track that wound through thick deciduous forest. The cabin itself sat in a clearing near a small creek, and it was exactly what you'd picture. Log construction, wide front porch, a cluster of smaller outbuildings scattered around. There were already 6 or 7 cars parked in a makeshift lot, and I could hear voices and music drifting from the back of the property. Rebecca's family was friendly and overwhelming in equal measure. I met probably 20 people in the first hour, most of whose names I immediately forgot. Everyone seemed genuinely happy Rebecca had brought someone, and I fielded the usual questions about how we met and what I taught, and whether I was a Bama fan or an Auburn fan. I learned quickly that the correct answer was Bama. The first night passed without incident. We had a big cookout, sat around a fire pit, and I successfully avoided embarrassing myself. Rebecca's younger cousin, a kid named Tyler who was maybe 13, attached himself to me for part of the evening and told me excitedly about a cool fort he and his brother had found in the woods earlier that day. Rebecca's dad, who'd been drinking beer steadily since we arrived, overheard and told Tyler not to go back there. "There's old hunting stands and deadfalls all over these woods," he'd said. "Last thing we need is you breaking an ankle on some rotten platform." Tyler had shrugged and wandered off, and the conversation moved on. On Saturday, Rebecca and I went for a walk after lunch. She wanted to show me the creek, which she said was pretty this time of year. We followed a faint trail through the woods, and after about 10 minutes we reached the water, more of a stream than a creek, really, maybe 8 feet across and shallow enough to see the rocky bottom. We'd been standing there for a few minutes when Rebecca pointed to the opposite bank. "Is that what Tyler was talking about?" I looked where she was pointing. Maybe 60 feet upstream, back in the trees, I could see a structure. It was made of branches and saplings lashed together with what looked like rope or vines, forming a crude A-frame about 6 feet tall and maybe 8 feet deep. The front was open, and I could see it was hollow inside. "That's not a hunting stand," I said. We crossed the creek, stepping on rocks, and walked over to get a closer look. The structure was more elaborate up close, not just branches leaning together, but deliberately constructed, with smaller sticks woven between the larger ones to create walls. Inside, the ground had been cleared of leaves and rocks, and there were signs that someone had spent time there. A circle of stones arranged in the center, like a small fire ring. A plastic water bottle in one corner, empty and faded by sun. And scratched into the dirt near the back, the word "help" in capital letters, the lines deep and desperate-looking. "Jesus," Rebecca said quietly, "should we tell someone?" "Tell them what?" I said. "That we found a shelter in the woods with 'help' written in it. Could be from years ago, could be kids playing." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something about the place felt wrong. The air inside the shelter was colder than it should have been, and I had this growing sense that we were intruding, that we'd stepped into a space we weren't supposed to enter. "Let's go back," Rebecca said. I nodded, and we recrossed the creek and headed back toward the cabin. Neither of us mentioned the shelter to anyone else that day. I'm not sure why. Maybe because Rebecca's dad had already told Tyler to stay out of the woods. Or maybe because neither of us wanted to alarm people for no reason. But that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I lay awake in the cabin's guest room listening to the sounds of the forest outside, and I couldn't stop thinking about that word scratched in the dirt. Sunday morning, Tyler was missing. I woke up to voices outside, adults calling Tyler's name. By the time I got dressed and went out onto the porch, half the family was already spreading out to search the property. Tyler's mom was crying, and Rebecca's dad was trying to organize search groups. "He's probably just wandered off," someone said. "You know how kids are." But Tyler's brother said Tyler had been acting weird the night before, saying he wanted to go back to the fort in the woods but was too scared to go alone. He asked his brother to come with him, but the brother had refused. "He said there was someone at the fort who needed help," the brother told Rebecca's dad. "He said he saw them." Rebecca and I exchanged a look. Without saying anything, we headed toward the trail to the creek. We found Tyler at the shelter. He was sitting inside the A-frame, cross-legged, staring at the back wall. He didn't acknowledge us when we approached, didn't turn around even when Rebecca called his name. "Tyler, everyone's looking for you," Rebecca said. "You need to come back." He finally turned his head. His expression was blank, eyes unfocused. "She told me to wait here." "Who told you?" I asked. "The lady. She said someone would come for me if I waited." There was no one else there. We could see clearly in every direction, just trees and underbrush and the creek nearby. Rebecca crouched down next to Tyler and took his arm gently. "Come on, let's get you back to your mom." He stood up, still moving in that slow, detached way, and let Rebecca lead him out of the shelter. I followed, glancing back once at the structure. The word "help" had been erased from the dirt. In its place, scratched fresh and deep, was a new word: "Thanks." We got Tyler back to the cabin, where his mother hugged him and cried and asked where he'd been. He didn't answer, just stared at nothing with that same empty expression. Rebecca's dad decided they should take him to a doctor in town, and within an hour Tyler and his parents had left. The rest of the weekend was subdued. People packed up early, and by Sunday evening it was just Rebecca and me and her parents left. We drove back to Tuscaloosa that night instead of waiting until Monday morning like we'd planned. I asked Rebecca a few days later if she'd heard how Tyler was doing. She said he was fine, acting normal again, but he didn't remember anything about Sunday morning. He remembered finding the fort on Friday, but everything after Saturday night was just gone from his memory. Rebecca and I broke up about 2 months later. It wasn't because of the cabin or Tyler or any of that. We just drifted apart the way people sometimes do. But I've thought about that weekend a lot since then. I've thought about the shelter in the woods and the words scratched in the dirt and Tyler sitting inside like he was waiting for something. Mostly, though, I think about the new message. Thanks. Because if someone or something was thanking us, it means we gave them what they wanted. And I can't help but wonder if Tyler really did come back fine, or if what came back was just something wearing Tyler's face, something that now sits at family dinners and goes to school and acts normal while waiting for whatever comes next. Rebecca never mentioned the cabin again, and I never asked. Some conversations are better left unfinished. Story 7. I was working as a surveyor for a civil engineering firm out of Anniston, and in the summer of 2021, we got contracted to do preliminary surveys for a proposed timber road in Talladega National Forest. The plan was to evaluate a section of forest in the northwestern corner near Heflin for potential logging access, which meant I'd be spending a few days out there with my equipment taking measurements, marking coordinates, and documenting terrain features. I'd done this kind of work dozens of times. It's solitary and sometimes tedious, but I liked being outdoors and the pay was solid. The Forest Service provided me with maps and GPS coordinates for the survey area, and I drove out early on a Monday morning with my gear loaded in the back of my truck. The section I was surveying was remote, accessed by a service road that hadn't seen much maintenance. I parked at the end of the passable section and hiked the remaining mile to my starting coordinates. The forest was beautiful that time of year. Thick canopy of oak and hickory, understory full of ferns and mountain laurel, relatively easy terrain to work in. I spent Monday and Tuesday working without incident. I'd hike in each morning, spend 6 or 7 hours collecting data, then hike back to my truck and drive to the motel in Heflin where I was staying. By Wednesday, I was ahead of schedule and in good spirits. Wednesday afternoon, I was working in a section of forest on a gradual slope when I noticed something odd. According to my GPS and the maps I had, there should have been a small stream cutting through this area, but there was no water, no stream bed, nothing. I double-checked my coordinates. I was definitely in the right place, but the stream just didn't exist. I marked it as a discrepancy to note in my report and kept working. About an hour later, I found the tree. It was a massive oak, probably 4 feet in diameter and ancient-looking, standing by itself in a small clearing. What caught my attention wasn't its size, but what was carved into the bark. Someone had used a knife or chisel to carve a series of symbols in a rough vertical line up the trunk, starting about waist height and going up maybe 6 feet. The symbols weren't letters or any language I recognized, just geometric shapes, circles with lines through them, triangles with dots, that sort of thing. I took photos for documentation purposes, more out of curiosity than anything else. The carvings looked old, the bark having grown around the edges of some of them, but a few near the top looked newer, the exposed wood still relatively light-colored. I was kneeling down to set up my equipment for the next measurement when I heard the sound. It was a voice, a woman's voice calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest. I couldn't make out words, just the tone, urgent, maybe frightened. I stood up and listened. The voice came again, closer this time, definitely calling for help. "Hey," I shouted. "Are you okay? Where are you?" No response. But then I heard movement in the undergrowth, something large pushing through the bushes maybe 50 yards away. I grabbed my radio to call for help, then remembered I was out of range. The handheld radios we used only worked within a few miles, and I was way past that. "I'm coming," I called out, and started moving in the direction of the sound. I'd gone maybe 30 feet when I realized I'd left my equipment behind. I stopped, debating whether to go back for it when the voice called again. It was behind me now, back near the tree with the carvings, and this time I recognized it. It was my voice, my own voice calling for help. I stood frozen, trying to process what I was hearing. It called again, the words clearer now. "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" The exact words I'd shouted a minute earlier, in my exact tone and inflection. Something was mimicking me. I backed away slowly, not toward the tree but perpendicular to it, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was back there. The voice called again, still using my words, and then I heard movement again, not through the undergrowth this time but up in the canopy. Branches creaking and leaves rustling like something was moving through the treetops. I ran. I didn't try to go back for my equipment, didn't try to navigate carefully. I just ran downslope in what I hoped was the direction of the service road, crashing through bushes and jumping over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear it following, the sound of branches breaking and that voice, my voice, calling out occasionally in what sounded like confusion or frustration. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes. Eventually I burst out onto the service road, gasping and sweating, my shirt torn from branches. My truck was a mile downhill, and I could see it in the distance. I ran the entire mile without looking back. When I got to the truck, I locked myself inside and sat there shaking for probably 20 minutes. Then I started the engine and drove straight to the motel. I didn't call my supervisor until the next morning, and when I did, I lied. I said I'd felt sick, maybe heat exhaustion, and had decided to cut the survey short. I'd go back later in the week to retrieve my equipment and finish the job. I never went back. I called my supervisor the following Monday and quit, made up a story about a family emergency in another state, lost the deposit on my equipment, lost the second half of my pay for the job, didn't care. I'd already decided that no amount of money was worth going back into those woods, but about 3 weeks later, I was at home in Anniston when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and there was silence on the other end. Then I heard it, my own voice, faint and distant, saying, "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" I hung up immediately. The number called back twice more over the next hour, but I didn't answer. When I finally worked up the nerve to call it back the next day, I got a recording saying the number was not in service. I've gotten that call 4 more times since then, always from a different number, always the same thing, silence, then my voice saying those same words. The last time was about 3 months ago. I don't answer numbers I don't recognize anymore. And I don't do survey work anymore either. I switched careers entirely. I'm in it now, working from home, nowhere near any forests. But sometimes at night when the house is quiet, I hear movement outside. Nothing I can see when I look out the windows, just the sound of something moving around in the dark. And once I heard it again, my voice faint and distant, coming from the backyard. I keep all my doors and windows locked now. I don't go outside after dark. And I've thought about moving, maybe to a city where there aren't any woods nearby, where everything is concrete and streetlights and other people. But I don't think it would help. I think whatever found me in those woods followed me home, and it's patient, it's learning. And one day it's going to sound exactly like me, so much so that I won't be able to tell the difference. And when that happens, I don't know what it will do. I just know that I won't be able to trust my own voice anymore. And neither will anyone else. Story 8. My friend Elena and I decided to go camping in Conecuh National Forest for her birthday weekend last April. We'd both moved to Alabama from out of state for work. She was from Oregon, I was from Colorado, and we'd been complaining about how much we missed being in nature, really out in the wilderness, instead of just visiting state parks with paved trails and picnic areas. Elena found information online about Conecuh, which is down in the southern part of Alabama near the Florida border, and it looked perfect. Over 80,000 acres, primitive camping allowed, and supposed to be relatively empty compared to more popular spots. We left Mobile on Friday afternoon and drove down through Evergreen, stopping for supplies in a little town called Andalusia before heading into the forest. The ranger station was closed when we arrived around 6 p.m., but there was a self-service permit station where we filled out a form and dropped our money in a lockbox. The ranger information board had a map showing designated camping areas, and we picked a spot near Open Pond, which the map indicated was about 2 miles in from the parking area. The hike-in was longer than we'd expected. The trail was poorly maintained, overgrown in places, and we had to consult our GPS frequently to make sure we were heading the right direction. By the time we reached the camping area near the pond, the sun was setting and we hurried to get our tent up before full darkness. Open Pond wasn't much to look at, more of a large puddle than a pond, surrounded by cypress trees and lily pads with a faint smell of stagnant water. But the camping area itself was decent, a flat spot large enough for our tent and a fire ring that showed signs of previous use. We got a fire going, cooked dinner on our camp stove, and settled in for the evening. It was peaceful in that way that camping can be when you're far from civilization, just the crackle of the fire and the sounds of frogs and insects from the pond. We talked and drank wine from a box Elena had brought, and by 10 p.m. we were tired enough to call it a night. I woke up sometime later to Elena shaking my shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. At first, I couldn't hear anything unusual, just the normal nighttime sounds. Then I caught it, a rhythmic splashing sound coming from the direction of the pond. Splash, pause, steady and repetitive. "Probably a gator," I said, though I wasn't sure if there were alligators this far north in Alabama. "It sounds too regular," Elena said, "like someone walking through water." We lay there listening for maybe 5 minutes. The splashing continued, never varying in rhythm, never getting closer or farther away. Eventually, Elena unzipped the tent door a few inches and peered out. "Can you see anything?" I asked. "It's too dark. The fire's out." I found my flashlight and crawled to the tent door beside her. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the pond. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the water. It was perfectly still, no movement at all. But standing at the edge of the pond, partially obscured by a cypress tree, was a figure. It was human-shaped but wrong somehow, the proportions not quite right, too tall or too thin or both. It was facing away from us, toward the water, and it was completely motionless. "Hello," Elena called out, her voice shaky. The figure didn't move. The splashing sound had stopped the moment I turned on the flashlight. I swept the beam across the pond, trying to see if there were other people, if this was maybe just another camper, but there was only the one figure, standing there silent and still. "We should stay in the tent," I said quietly. Elena nodded, and we zipped the door shut. We lay there in the darkness. I turned off the flashlight to save the battery and waited. After about 10 minutes, the splashing started again. Same rhythm, same steady repetition. It continued for the rest of the night. Every time it stopped, we'd work up the courage to look outside, and every time we looked, the figure would be standing there at the pond's edge, motionless. Sometimes it was in a different position, beside a different tree or closer to our camp or farther away, but it was always facing away from us, always silent and still while we looked. We didn't sleep. When dawn finally came and gray light started filtering through the tent walls, we packed up as quickly as possible and started hiking back to the parking area. Neither of us talked about what we'd seen. We just moved fast, both of us glancing back over our shoulders every few minutes. We were about halfway back to the parking area when we found it. A boot, sitting in the middle of the trail. Just one boot, a hiking boot, men's size by the look of it, relatively new. We stopped and stared at it. "Should we?" Elena started, then trailed off. I shook my head. We walked around it and kept going. The parking area was empty when we arrived, no other cars, no sign of anyone else. We loaded our gear into Alina's car and drove out of the forest without stopping at the ranger station. It wasn't until we were back on the highway, 20 miles away, that Alina asked, "Did you notice the boot wasn't wet?" I had noticed. It had been sitting in the middle of a dirt trail in a forest where everything is damp from humidity and morning dew. But the boot had been completely dry, inside and out, like it had just been placed there. We stopped at a restaurant in Andalusia and sat in the parking lot for a while, both of us shaky and exhausted. Alina tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was another camper playing a prank. Maybe we'd been half asleep and imagined details that weren't there. But we both knew we hadn't been asleep. We'd both seen the figure multiple times in multiple positions. "I'm never camping in Alabama again," Alina said finally. I agreed. But about 2 weeks later, Alina called me. She'd been going through photos on her phone from the trip. She'd taken some pictures during the hike in before we reached the pond. She texted me one of the photos. It showed the trail ahead of us, Alina's backpack visible in the foreground, and in the background, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, was a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless beside the path, facing away from the camera. We walked right past it on our way in, and neither of us had noticed. Alina moved back to Oregon 2 months ago. She said it was because she missed her family and the Pacific Northwest, and that was part of it. But I think Conecuh National Forest was also part of it. I think she wanted to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever we saw at Open Pond. I'm still in Mobile. I haven't gone camping since, haven't even gone hiking. But sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a tall, thin figure standing beside the road, facing away from me. When I look directly at it, there's nothing there, just trees or a telephone pole or shadows. But I can't shake the feeling that it's following me, that whatever was at Open Pond wasn't tied to that place, that it's something that can move, that can find you again if it wants to. Alina doesn't answer my calls anymore. I've tried a dozen times over the past month, and it always goes to voicemail. I'm telling myself she's just busy, that she's adjusting to being back home. But part of me wonders if she's avoiding me because talking to me means remembering that weekend, and maybe she's trying to forget. Or maybe something else happened, something she doesn't want to tell me about. Maybe that figure in the woods wasn't following me. Maybe it was following her and it figured out where she went. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong. I hope she's safe in Oregon and just needs space. But I also keep thinking about that boot on the trail, sitting there dry and deliberate, and I wonder whose boot it was and what happened to the person who was wearing it. And I wonder if we were supposed to pick it up, if that was some kind of test or invitation, and what would have happened if we had. Story 9. I inherited a dirt bike from my cousin Jay when he moved to Texas for work. It was a Yamaha, a few years old but well-maintained, and he said I should take it rather than letting him sell it for next to nothing. I'd ridden motorcycles a little bit in college, so I figured why not. I lived in Opelika at the time, and there were plenty of trails and back roads around Lee County where I could ride without dealing with traffic. I'd had the bike for maybe a month when I decided to explore some of the forest roads south of town, down toward the Chattahoochee River. There's a whole network of old logging roads and trails in that area, some maintained by the Forest Service and some just abandoned remnants from decades ago. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just wanted to ride and see where the trails went. It was mid-September, hot and humid even though it was late afternoon. I'd been riding for about an hour, following a dirt road that wound through pine forest when I came to a fork. To the left, the road continued on in relatively good condition. To the right, it narrowed to barely more than a trail, overgrown with weeds and clearly not used much. I took the right fork. The trail got rougher quickly, lots of exposed roots and rocks, and I had to slow down significantly to navigate it. After maybe 10 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing, and that's when I saw the vehicles. There were 3 of them, 2 cars and a truck, all parked haphazardly in the clearing, all old and covered in rust and vines. The cars looked like they were from the 80s or 90s based on the body styles, and the truck was even older, maybe 70s. All of them had been sitting there long enough that small trees were growing up through the wheel wells and saplings were pressing against the doors. I stopped my bike and killed the engine. It was dead quiet except for the ticking of the bike's engine cooling down and the buzz of insects. I walked over to the nearest car, a faded blue sedan, and peered through the grimy window. The interior was gutted. No seats, no dashboard, no steering wheel. Just an empty shell with rust holes in the floor large enough to see the ground underneath. The other vehicles were the same, completely stripped of anything useful or valuable. I should have left then. There was nothing interesting here, just abandoned cars in the woods, something you can find in rural Alabama without too much trouble. But something made me walk around to the far side of the clearing, where the forest got thick again. That's where I found the path. It wasn't a road or even a proper trail, just a narrow gap between the trees where the undergrowth had been trampled down. It looked recent. The disturbed vegetation was still relatively fresh. Without really thinking about it, I followed it. The path went about 50 yards into the forest before it ended at a small depression in the ground, like a shallow pit maybe 10 feet across and 3 feet deep. The bottom of the pit was covered with leaves, but poking up through the leaves I could see metal, license plates, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all piled together and partially buried. I crouched down at the edge of the pit and pulled one of the plates free. It was an Alabama plate, but old. The design was from the early 2000s. I pulled out another, late 90s. Another, 80s, all Alabama plates, all old, all just dumped here and left to rust. I was still crouching there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing when I heard the engine. It was distant but getting closer, a vehicle coming down the same trail I'd taken. I dropped the license plate and hurried back toward the clearing. By the time I got there, I could see a truck coming through the trees, an old Chevy pickup, moving slowly over the rough terrain. My bike was right there in the middle of the clearing, completely visible. There was nowhere to hide it, nowhere for me to go that wouldn't be obvious. The truck pulled into the clearing and stopped about 20 feet from my bike. A man got out. He was maybe 60, wearing jeans and a stained t-shirt with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. He looked at my bike, then looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just riding around, checking out the trails." He stared at me for a long moment, then looked past me toward the path I'd just come from. "You find anything interesting back there?" "Just trees," I lied. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He walked over to his truck bed and reached in, pulling out a heavy chain. He started walking toward the abandoned vehicles, dragging the chain behind him. "Might want to head on out," he said without looking at me. "Gonna be dark soon, easy to get turned around in these woods at night." I didn't need to be told twice. I walked quickly to my bike, started it up, and turned around. As I rode back down the trail toward the main road, I glanced in my mirror once. The man was standing in the clearing, watching me leave, the chain hanging from his hand. I rode straight home and didn't go back to that area. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, the stripped vehicles, the pile of license plates, that man appearing right after I'd found them. So I did something probably stupid. I looked up missing persons cases in Lee County from the past few decades. I found six people who disappeared in the area around Lee County between 1987 and 2014, all of them cases where the person had been driving somewhere and just never arrived. No bodies ever found, no vehicles ever recovered, no leads. I don't know if those license plates were connected to those cases. I don't have any proof, and I'm not about to go to the police with a story about stumbling onto some suspicious metal in the woods. But I can't shake the feeling that I found something I wasn't supposed to find, and that the man in the clearing knew exactly what I'd seen. I sold the dirt bike about a month later. Told people I just wasn't riding it enough to justify keeping it, which was true. But the real reason was that every time I looked at it, I thought about that clearing and those stripped vehicles and the way that man had looked at me like he was deciding something. And I still think about those missing people sometimes. I think about how easy it would be to disappear on a back road in rural Alabama. How many miles of empty forest there are where no one would ever find you. How someone could spend decades dumping evidence in a pit in the woods and no one would ever know. I don't ride back roads anymore. I stick to highways and populated areas, and when I drive past unmarked dirt roads leading into the forest, I keep going. Because I learned something that day in that clearing. Some places aren't empty. Some places have people in them who don't want to be found, who have reasons for choosing isolation. And if you stumble into their space, if you see what they've been hiding, you might not get a second chance to leave. I was lucky. That man let me go. But I don't think he would have given me a second chance if I'd tried to go back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.